welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 266. Thank you for joining us. What did people know in the Middle Ages that we are only now rediscovering? To answer this question, Bonnie and I are joined by blogger, Substack contributor, author, and podcaster Leila Lawler to discuss St. Hildegard von Bingen. Leila recently wrote the introduction for a beautiful new book by Paul Ferris titled St. Hildegard's Garden. She introduces us to the wisdom of St. Hildegard and the saint's idea of Viriditas. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and director of development for Kolbe Academy.
We are visiting today with Leila Marie Lawler, whom listeners might recognize from her blog Like Mother, Like Daughter, or the Substacks that she writes, or her books, or the podcast that she does with her husband, Phil. She's here to discuss a doctor of the church who lived almost 1,000 years ago, whose writings on health and nutrition are applied to the present day in the book St. Hildegard's Garden, Recipes and Remedies for Healing Body and Soul, written by Paul Ferris and published by Sophia Institute Press. Mrs. Lawler, welcome to the Kolbecast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's lovely to meet you. I am, as I mentioned before we started recording, I'm a fan of your blog. I drew great comfort and inspiration from it as a mom. When my kids were young, my kids are teenagers up to 20 now. And as a young mom, I drew great comfort from the concept of the reasonably clean house. That was a huge, huge help to me. How about you tell us about yourself, though? And I know you're a homeschooler yourself, that and your various things you're up to in your post-homeschool chapter, so forth.
Yeah, well, I'm not exactly sure where to start, but certainly I started out, I got married in 1979 and I was pretty young. And sometimes people, because since that does seem like a long time ago to people, and it is going on 46 years ago, which is kind of incredible. I do want to correct an impression that sometimes people get about me and about that time, which is that, oh, it was, so nice and calm and peaceful and traditional, and I'm from that era, and so I don't understand what people are going through today, because that is simply just not true. I had a very chaotic childhood. It was definitely, the 60s were a time of turmoil that I think actually um, although maybe for the BLM riots, maybe if you lived in one of those cities, but that's what I grew up with, was riots and unrest and protest and my parents divorcing and feminism gaining traction. And even though my father was Muslim, he was a professor and he absolutely believed that I should have a profession and a career and encouraged me and demanded excellence of me. I mean, it was like, you are my daughter and you are going to have this, big career ahead of you. And that's how I was raised. And only, at some point, kind of simultaneously with feeling like, yes, I am going to do all those things, and the world is changing and I need to take my place in it, I also just somehow in my heart knew that I wanted to have children and take care of them in the home. And funnily enough, homeschooling wasn't a part of it, but my husband, who did actually have that other idyllic life of, a faithful, intact family where he had one of those just normal childhoods, and went to all the schools. He was the one who was like, oh, we don't want to send them to school. And I thought, well, I kind of do.
Yeah.
And then he, he's very mild-mannered, so he never would ever force me to do anything, but he would always just kind of say, well, you could do that. You could teach them that. They don't need to go. And so when I realized that they actually could do better at home. I did not, so we have 7 children. I did not homeschool the eldest, and I kind of regret that looking back. But in the time period when we started, it was not a thing. And people, I don't even know if people can imagine what it's like to homeschool without the internet. But that was me. And all you had was like the book that you got out of the library after requesting it, and maybe an article here and there, and nobody, no friends, no groups. I mean, I did eventually have a couple of friends. We would have what we called the emergency meeting of our homeschooling group, which meant that we spent the afternoon together drinking iced tea and talking, and our kids ran amok in one of our yards. And that was the meeting of the homeschooling group.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
but yeah, so I probably looking back, I would say pretty idiosyncratic idea of what my kids' education should be, but also trying to just grapple with not having the skills, having been actually raised in this very feminist world that rejected homemaking. I just didn't have the skills, and I didn't have the tribe to help me figure out how to run my home, but yet actually the home is the environment that enables the true education to take place, because the children have to have time to think, they have to have peace and quiet, they have to have opportunities to run outside or pick up a musical instrument or what have you. And so the parents are really creating this environment, and the atmosphere, the environment, the conversations, the discussions, those are the background and the important part of the education that actually somebody has to be making that. And part of it is just keeping your house in order. So as I kind of reinvented that wheel for myself, and then got to be, my children were then growing up, and my youngest was pretty, independent, and I had a little time. I realized the blogging world had started, and I realized that a lot of women were actually falling into the same pitfalls, because the bloggers, who started like in the 2000s. I started blogging in 2007, I think, and they were very young, and a lot of them it started out with crafting blogs. So they were crafting, but then people would ask questions in the comments like, but how do take care of your kids? And oh, I see you're homeschooling, and how do you do this? And I found that they were so young and so inexperienced, because their children were so young, that they were kind of parroting some things that I knew to be just misguided and would not stand them in good stead when their kids got to be teenagers, when you really did have to have a household that ran, and you really did have to have a system of authority and firmness with affection and all of that. So that's what galvanized me to start writing. So I was kind of like, no, you all are just about to make, I alone am left to tell you that this is not the way. So I feel like, yeah, I was already just a bit older and had already gone through things, and was kind of like, do you also have to reinvent the wheel, or could I give you some of what I have learned along the way? Not that I in any way perfect or exemplify the things, but just I have the experience, and even the like, this is what I wish I had done, and these are the pitfalls. So I started writing about all of that, and that did seem to get an audience. And one thing that I'm appreciative about is that I never really cared. I never really paid that much attention to my stats, my readership stats, or I wasn't interested in promoting the blog or monetizing it or anything, which turned out to be very important, because another pitfall that I noticed was that those who went out to monetize their online presence actually ended up, in a lot of cases, really hurting their families. And so that got me even deeper into just like, what is the family, and why would you want to just really work hard against monetizing it, because it's the last place that isn't monetized. So, I mean, the last earthly place, right? So, um, Yeah, like you have to, in a certain sense, you have to monetize your business in a reasonable way, not to like exploit it, but you have to make money in what you do for your living. But there's some areas of life that you should not monetize. And, one of those being your marriage and the other being your home. So, um, now that I look back and I've been doing this for so long, I'm really grateful. First of all, I'm super grateful that the internet did not exist when I was younger because it was just really good sometimes to be alone, to be lonely, to not be connected, to experience all that. That strengthened me. It wasn't easy, but I think it gave me a lot of um, compassion for women in that situation, which I realize a lot of people are. However, sometimes your energy can be really dissipated by going online. So, and disastrous things can happen. So I'm glad that I was just protected by just simply when I was, what age I was. And now I'm a grandmother. And I'm very blessed that my daughters do homeschool their children. And yeah, so it's even more perspective.
The book we're talking about today, St. Hildegard's Garden Recipes and Remedies for Healing Body and Soul, as a way of getting into our discussion about this book, I want to offer you my introduction to St. Hildegard back in my late 90s music history class in college. I have my textbook still here with me from all those years ago. And there's this one entry about her in the beginning of the book, talking about liturgical chants and so forth. Hildegard of Bingen lived from 1098 to 1179. She stands out among the authors of poetic sequences because she composed the melodies as well as the verse. And it goes on for a little bit longer about her. So that was my introduction to St. Hildegard of Bingen. Fast forward several years, and I start seeing things coming out about St. Hildegard and all the other areas of her life that I did not know about. So, for folks who have not yet met St. Hildegard or know very little about her, would you say a bit about her and kind of a bit about the relatively recent interest in her?
So I had a similar introduction to her. I was aware of Pope Benedict um, making her, there's probably some particular phrase that in the church, there's always something elevated, created, named her doctor of the church. And of course, for me, the interest there is not only just wanting, I always felt that I could learn something from him, but also the interest of thinking, is he pandering to women? But he wouldn't have done that. So, what is the impetus here for making her a doctor of the church? And so I did read about her at that time, although it didn't make a huge impression other than to know, no, she's the real deal. And he clearly really respected her. So that made an impression on me. And then the next thing similar to you that made an impression is the finding out about the music and the chants. And my daughter Suzanne was studying music. She 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 went to two different colleges, and the first one before she transferred, she was at the University of Chicago, and there was a very lively group of Catholics who had a chant mass, and they chanted the liturgy, which is lovely. And at her wedding, her friends came and for the prelude, they did a Hildegard chant. It was pretty unearthly and pretty amazing. And so that really struck me. And then I read a book that I think your listeners, if your Colby people don't know about it, I bet they do though. It's called God's Hotel by Victoria Sweet. It's one of those books. She's not Catholic, but she's a doctor, and it is a book. It's one of those books that changes how you see everything. Well, with this God's Hotel, she's talking about medicine. And as a doctor, she wanted to get her degree in medical history. So she got a further degree, she got her PhD, and she was focusing on Hildegard. And so suffused throughout this book are her observations about the medieval approach to medicine, which also played a part in her actual practice, which you is so fascinating, and I highly recommend reading this book. But where I think most of us in our time dismiss the medieval period, especially in medicine, as being backwards and um, ignorant and not scientific, it was her observations that really opened my eyes to what the possibilities are of studying this and what is offered by the medieval worldview, and the idea of the connection, the hierarchy of being, and the connection, from God's creation, and how the lower reflects the higher. And yeah, so that really got me so interested. And then came lockdown. I mean, I come by it honestly, my resistance to mainstream medicine, because my mother was that kind of mother who would always say, like, do not eat the cherry that's on the sundae because it will give you cancer. Like, very anti red dye, very like, you have to read the labels. And I mean, long before Maha and Bobby Kennedy and whoever, I mean, I grew up this way. Like, my mother saying, that has BHT in it, you can't eat that. And I can remember as a child being kind of like, I really do want to eat that cherry. And I think one time I did and was like, it tastes disgusting. I don't know. She was right. But anyway, so I do come by my skepticism, honestly. But at the time of the lockdown, suddenly I think a lot of people started really questioning. And then after a year of that, there actually started to be shortages of actual medications like painkillers, especially for children at the pharmacy. I mean, I didn't have any little children, I'm a grandma, but I did think, wow, I would not be okay with not being able to buy ibuprofen for my child. But what did people do back in the day before? And then so I just started to get much more interested. I had always known about some herbs and various remedies, but had not really studied it. And I think it was in 21 or 22 that the iron entered my soul, and I thought I need to have a medicinal garden. And so then, anyway, I must have written about it, and I must have like posted on Instagram or whatever. But then when Sophia contacted me and said, would you want to, Sophia Press, would you write the foreword for this Hildegard book? I was really excited because by then I had studied more about her, and I realized that she's a true genius, and she's a true figure of just not only amazing intellect, but also spirit. So she's somebody who had mystical visions even from the time that she was a little child. And like Our Lady, she was taken to the monastery at a very early age, and so was infused with the Benedictine spirit. And later, of course, when she became a nun, a Benedictine nun, she then became the abbess. And is that so fitting because she truly was a leader, and she was a person of just like wide scope in her interests. So she wrote philosophy, she wrote theology. As we said, she was a musical composer. Because she was the abbess, she was responsible for and directed the liturgical life of her abbey. And so she had great freedom and scope, and that's where, she composed for the various feasts. And then she was a healer. She was definitely a healer. And so she was somebody who took the wisdom that had been handed down, and her amazing analytical mind just took hold of it, and she systematized it, and she brought her insight as well. And that's something that really comes out in the Victoria Suite book, that the idea of internalizing this and of really looking at the person and saying, what does this person need, observing the person, and trying to find where you can help them with your knowledge. And Hildegard had an amazing word for all of this, of the idea of health and what it is that goes through all of creation to give life. And the word that she used was Viriditas. And that word is something that has connotations of greenness and of life. And it's really beautiful, like how she really focused and brought this out in this idea that there is, I mean, the unfortunate thing is that without her context, it's easy to take this one little thing and kind of make it into almost something magical. And that's where you asked me about the sort of burgeoning interest that we see now in the world about her. And I think that that has to do with the deracinated spirituality that, you know, sometimes we think of as like new age, where certain things that are true are kind of wrenched out of their context and not uh, put in a rational system. And so people, they kind of impute magical properties to things. But if we really study her, we realize that all of this was very much in the context of not only of her faith, but of reason. And she was somebody who absolutely followed the teachings of the church and just of natural law. So she was not a person who was interested in overturning the natural order or the spiritual order.
My first exposure to St. Hildegard was in Austria, where we were visiting a family there, and the wife had had very poor health and had discovered St. Hildegard and had followed some of her recommendations for various things, what she should eat, what she shouldn't eat, and all
Oh,
of those things. And
yeah.
it made a huge difference in her health. So they were telling us all about these things. And I'd kind of been primed because my father had had a long history of poor health and nothing. I mean, medicine wasn't really doing stuff for him. Modern medicine wasn't. And so he had he had gone, one of our local doctors also practiced like homeopathic things and kind of was interested in ancient practices that seemed to be effective. And so, at the same time, I say all these things. I had had concussion, and some sort of it was a snake venom remedy that he had given me that made a huge difference in me coming back from feeling horrible to feeling normal again.
Uh-huh.
But so there's kind of this exposure there was my first exposure to Saint Hildegard. But I think I see what you're saying, kind of especially after the COVID pandemic, where now we kind of question the science. They kept talking about follow the science, and then come turns out that what they meant by science was just do what you're told. So I've had this experience where I've talked about some of these things to a doctor friend of mine. It's very funny because he says you realize that science doesn't. This isn't what's going on in science. This is just, it's like, but it works. There's this wisdom in it, and if you, especially reading Saint Hildegard, it may, it's very reasonable. It's very rational. It seems to me everything that she's talking about and well thought out, and not just like witchcraft sort of things, right?
No, no, not at all. And in fact, um, I mean, I actually do spend some time checking about, like, if something's presented to me as a remedy, I actually will go and check it out on National Institutes of Health studies, et cetera, to just find out whether there have been trials about this thing. And one of my most widely shared posts on my blog is my natural approach to urinary tract infections and cystitis. And that was something that was actually my daughter Suzanne also had said to me, Mom, that D mannose, which is a sugar, has been known to help. And so I actually then had a conversation with my other daughter's midwife, and she told me um, about marshmallow root and the effectiveness of that. And I actually looked these things up, and it turns out that there are scientific studies that back this up, and these are ancient remedies, actually, especially the D mannose, I mean, the marshmallow root. And then there are some other herbs as well, goldenrod, plantain. There are, which by the way, goldenrod and plantain turn out to be very effective for a lot of things and are actually, we think of as weeds. Like you wouldn't grow them purposely in your garden. You're actually trying to get the plantain, especially out of your yard. But but so you don't have to intentionally plant it in the garden. They're just out there, totally a free gift out there that before you were pulling out and throwing away, and now you're kind of like, oh, maybe I will actually dry that or make a tincture out of it. But what not only do the scientific studies back it up, but until before the time in the late 60s when the pharmaceutical companies kind of took off, speaking of monetizing things, and that's a whole other topic, but before that time, physicians actually had manuals on their shelves that were guides to preparing herbs for remedies. And it had been the way medicine was conducted. Then the idea got into the industry that people should, that the remedies that people took should be profitable to the companies. And that edged out a lot of these things because, I mean, for instance, aspirin just simply is not a moneymaker, but Tylenol is. So that meant that then doctors were trained to give you that monetized remedy. So if you present with a urinary tract infection, the doctor is going to prescribe an antibiotic, and he's not going to say, first, I want you to take this, that, and the other. When I wrote that all up in my blog post, I mean, I have multiple readers who have said to me, it is worth the price of your book, which is not a cheap price. It's not a cheap book. The Summa Domestica, it is worth it to buy for that post, for that remedy, because now we don't have to take antibiotics anymore. And it's like, okay, well, this actually works. It's actually known to work by the scientific community. However, it is just simply not something that doctors, first of all, they don't think that you're going to do it. Like they're kind of like, is my patient gonna, over the course of, 2 weeks, prepare these herbs and this tea and take this? Probably not. I just need to give them a pill that they're just going to take. So that's a problem. It's a problem on all sides. But you're absolutely right that we can see that it works. Interestingly, too, I have definitely found that the herbs that I collect from the garden or the field, um, the intense amount of brush that I have growing all around my house, um, work better, are clearly more effective than supplements that I buy that have the same name. It just seems like if I have a bottle that's labeled goldenrod with capsules of goldenrod, it just doesn't work as well as the goldenrod that I collected myself. So that's another interesting thing, is kind of like you can't monetize this. It requires somebody who just wants to do it and who's studied a little bit and who knows when to do it. And I have a pantry full of jars. I didn't even, at first, when I started in this idea of the medicinal garden, I thought, well, this is going to take me ages to figure out. Well, all of a sudden, I have all these remedies, and it actually doesn't take that long, but it does just take a certain amount of focus. So, like, do we consign all of this to the expert level and just say, well, they'll take care of it because they're the ones who went to school or whatever? Or do we take ownership of it and say, well, we actually could do this? And actually, it's super easy. I know for myself that when um, I first heard of the idea of making a tincture, that seemed really overwhelming to me. But the overwhelming part is buying the bottle of Everclear that, like just a very um, strong alcohol that you can put the herbs into, but it's actually way easier than making jam or jelly or anything. Like it's just super easy. And you just also have to keep that bottle up really high where nobody can reach it. But I also read a really interesting account of from a pharmacist about her lament that in the past, the pharmacist had a much bigger role in the community for helping with health issues because the pharmacist knew all of these things. And then that role was not only supplanted by the pharmaceutical industry, and then the pharmacist was just an agent, but actually the pharmacist began to be forbidden by law to and regulations to give the patient or the person coming to him the information because you're not a doctor. Well, they had a lot of knowledge and a lot of information. So yeah, I think it would be good to recover some of those things, take a little more ownership of those things, and to know that one thing I think is interesting is just to think about how most of the ailments and most of the problems that people have are a matter of nursing care, not specifically medical care. Like you just need to be able to give that person rest and nourishing food and sunshine and wipe their brow and put on a compress. Those are all nursing things, which Hildegard saw and respected. And the medieval model is for, and it was at the time, orders of nuns who provided this care. So God's Hotel, that name comes from the Hôte de Dieu, which is the French original, hospital. And it was for the poor because normally if you had the community and the family, your family would take care of you. But the poor were taken care of in these hotels, God's Hotel, run by the sisters who were nurses. So the entire hospital was run by nurses. Today, the hospitals are run, well, they started to be run by physicians. Now they're run by hospitalists who are efficiency experts who have no medical background. And so, in the book In God's Hotel, she talks about that. It's really fascinating. But anyway, that's not the book we're talking about right now.
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the things that comes up is that whole, I mean, not like one of the problems in medicine today, I think, is that, there are all of these things that the doctors should follow. It's like if they come in with this is the series of steps I need to take. And you can tell with the litigious sort of society that we have that in order to protect themselves, that's what they have to do. But when I read some of St. Hildegard or some of these traditional medicines, there's more of an interest in the person as a whole. So like, is this just an illness that has come up, or is there something that's off in the body that needs to be put back into order? And so I think I'm speaking to that with some of these, the nursing, the sort of good diet, rest, sunshine, sort of things.
Right, right, which the Viriditas really is expressed through all those things. And all of that to say, too, that the medical profession was also that way. Medicine had been very much a matter of learning, of knowing so much about anatomy, and knowing so much about cases and having so much experience and being able to look at the patient and diagnose the patient. Diagnosis is something that you do need a doctor for. And I feel bad for doctors because medicine does have something really amazing to offer to people. But our current practice, as you say, like it's kind of run by the insurance companies that there's this checklist, you have to go down it. And if you don't, you can lose your license. And that seems really unfair to the doctors. So I do think that St. Hildegard has so much to offer us. And yes, you're right, especially in this realm of looking at the whole person. And right now, the medicine has become a matter of specialties. And when you're a general practitioner, you basically are consigned to shuffling patients off to various specialists. Where in the past, I think the general practitioner was actually required to know a lot of specialties and to be someone who could do all the things. And it's interesting too, when you are taking care of someone who truly is sick, you are really struck by how those specialists are not talking to each other. I remember with my mother, she had a heart procedure and then subsequently, very shortly after, entered into this like gastrointestinal difficulty that actually turned out to be pancreatic cancer. And the heart doctors totally signed off. They were just like, we don't know. You had to take her to the emergency room. Like, and then there was never any communication between the two who even knew whether there was some effect that this heart procedure had on the rest of her system that triggered something. No one will ever know because nobody's talking to anybody else. In order to study it, you have to at least ask the question. And it's so, I think if I were one of those specialists, I would be very frustrated to think that I was completely narrowly confined to this one system of the body and could not even ask questions or know about the rest of it. That seems really strange to me. So, yeah, I think Hildegard has a lot to offer about restoring the pursuit of health to a more reasonable, rational, and spiritual realm so that we can go back to looking at the whole person and treating the person to enliven their viriditas so that they can recover health.
Several of our Colby colleagues took notice of this book and were expressing excitement about it. And so I asked them, like, what do you most want to know about this book? So we have 2 points from our Colby colleagues. Wanted to get your input on this. The first being, what did St. Hildegard know in her time that is only recently coming to the forefront of health and nutrition science? I think some of this has come up along the way, but is there more to say on that, or are there things that have not yet come up that would be kind of fitting within that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I mean, one obstacle is that we don't know a ton about what St. Hildegard knew, and it would be really good to know more. But I will also say that she was very much a medieval person, which means that she was firmly ensconced in that what C.S. Lewis calls the discarded image of the hierarchy of being and the connection of every part of creation to every other part of creation. And, the analogical relationships and from the movement of the stars, from the mind of God to the movement of the stars to the lowest animal, and even to the not discounting the rocks, that there is a connectivity that is reasonable. It's not magic, it is reasonable. And I think in that sense, Hildegard was totally a woman of her time that we would do well to recover because we have disconnected ourselves from everything and then we invert. So we see something beautiful, we see something that draws us to wonder in the created world, and we impute divinity to that thing. Where she would have seen a reflection of the divine, she would have seen it as something created by the divine, and so therefore participating in it, but not as something that in itself was divine. And for us to recover that would really be helpful because we are really suffering from, yeah, that sense of just being, well, I don't know, I'm sure you all have read Walker Percy, just like this like we're just floating around in out in space and we're having a really hard time connecting. We desire to connect to both to the spiritual realm and to the earthly realm. And she holds the key to that, being a medieval woman, because, you know, that was how they looked at everything. That was the philosophy of the time. And it has a lot of resonance and I think could really help us. We've just gone so far away from it. Another thing is this idea of the balance that God made things to be balanced. And her, she had that medieval notion of the humors, which is also reflected in other cultures that weren't Christians. So, ancient cultures, Chinese culture, this idea of balance. And it just does make sense to me that the things that you experience, a lot of them, I mean, some things you experience are like you broke your leg. So then you need healing for your leg. And it's really great that technology has advanced so that the doctor can set your leg and it will heal really quickly. It's interesting that I have an herb growing in my garden that is called bone knit comfrey, and that will actually really heal your bone. And I actually did get a really bad injury to my foot and put a comfrey compress on it, and the next day it was fine. But a lot of things, I would say most things are because something is out of balance. So I think that people are starting to realize that, and also that you can, with these herbs that you can take, you can also know for yourself which way the balance is going. So, there are some things like mint is very cooling and ginger is very warming. They're both prescribed for um, an upset stomach. And if the ginger isn't helping you, then you can kind of be like, oh, I guess maybe my body needs to be cooled. And maybe you'd find that the mint helps you. And that's really you, that it might be somebody else might have an upset stomach and the ginger might help them. And I think that's a really wonderful idea that we could just think about how we feel and go by that. Then another thing that I think is so amazing that she knew was that the remedies are out there in nature. And one thing that I've learned, and I don't know if she said this, but I bet she did, is that the often the remedy for the so if there's a plant that's poisonous, the remedy will be growing near it. That I think is very interesting.
Yeah.
That connectedness has just come up multiple times then. I mean, as you're again talking and think about modern science, one scientist can't really even talk to another scientist these days because they're so separated. And what you've made clear with Saint Hildegard is that she really knit, I mean, from the mysticism through the, music, running the abbey, the knowing the herbs, everything was connected and thought in a whole, which I guess you've really laid out that's something that we definitely lack today.
Yeah.
The other suggestion that we received is to discuss the connection between our faith and caring for our health and bodies. What do you think she would say about that, or what are your thoughts
She
there?
had a lot to say um about mental health. And that is so interesting to me. I would love to know more about it. I am by no means a Hildegard expert. I wish I were. But I think it is very interesting that I mean, the woman was a genius. And that's something else. Is like we do just need geniuses. We need people with a lot of insight, and we should heed them and not think that just because we break everything down and divide it up into categories that we necessarily can be content with that. And she had so much insight, and she did understand people who are sad, people who are depressed, and she knew that faith plays a huge role in that. And I think it's interesting that recently I think it was last year, there was quite a bit of pushback against the previous, I would say, couple of decades of the narrative being that if you are suffering from a mental illness, you have a chemical imbalance and you need to take some sort of medication that would address that imbalance. And I think it was about last year or so where some pretty mainstream people were pushing against that and saying, no, you cannot reduce depression, anxiety, and so forth to a simple chemical imbalance. And actually, that these medications can be extremely harmful to you and extremely harmful to your mental health. And that one of the side effects of SSRIs is thoughts of suicide, which that just does not seem like a good remedy to depression to me. So it feels like, yes, we need something better. And she did. I mean, I cannot speak to exactly what she said. What's interesting about this book is the book has it has a forward by me, and then it has an introduction and a biography of her, and then many plates of that are prints of the various plants. And it's not encyclopedic, it's more of a survey, and it has a lot of quotes from her and ways it goes into ways that she would have used these particular plants. And there is a lot of knowledge in there gleaned from her about it's not just physical ailments. Some of it is also the patient's mental state. And I just think that that's beautiful because I don't think it actually, there are times for sure that, you're just lacking vitamin D. I mean, certainly, I told you before we started that it's raining and cold today, but when spring came and the sun came out, I definitely experienced a change in my mental state, no question about it. Like, there's no question that, we do need our vitamin D. And we do need our sunshine. But then there are deeper things that trouble us. Sometimes our conscience can trouble us. And having a bad conscience or a troubled conscience can cause a lot of anxiety, a lot of and depression, and to fail to address that aspect, and people belittle it because sometimes people who have struggled with mental illness get angry if you say, oh, well, it's spiritual, because they reduce that to, well, you can pray it away. And I don't think that Hildegard would say that, and I don't think that any serious person of faith would say that. It's not that you're going to make some sort of incantation and then God will make it all better, but it is important to realize that we can be troubled in our spirit and we can be not trusting God, or we can have all sorts of spiritual struggles that were not, that I couldn't necessarily enumerate right now. And those things would have an effect on our body because our body and our soul are the two parts of our nature. They form the unity of what it means to be a human being and a person. And so we are not just, there's that bogus quote from C.S. Lewis saying you're a body in your, what does he say? It's not right. It's not a quote from him, but it's like a made up thing that was going around that was like, you're a spirit that has a body. No, we are spirit and body that are completely united with each other. When we rise again, when we have our resurrected bodies, we will have physical bodies. That is clear because our Lord Jesus Christ himself in the resurrection had a physical body with its wounds. So I think those are spiritual truths that Hildegard totally believed in, totally supported and expressed and spoke about. And so I'm quite sure that that was part of, the background of her thought as she was addressing the mental illness of her patients.
I mean, again, just this connectedness. And connectedness is coming up, and integration sort of ideas, because it clearly, I mean, we know that when we don't get enough sleep or when we're sick, we're more agitated or irritable or whatever. But I think we don't often think about kind of the opposite, like when you're just smiling can actually make you happier. Just,
Right.
and then with the modern neuroscience and things, you see that even somebody else smiling in the room can make you happier as well. So this
That's true.
the connectedness there, and then that, not breaking things off all the time into just their own little components just seems like it seems like we're slowly learning this again, relearning it again after
Yes,
Yep.
hundreds of years.
so true. In my forward, I really try to warn against what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, which is, has definitely been a syndrome of every era, but I think ours is, uh, we practice it to a rather frightening degree, which is to think that we know everything. We represent the synthesis of anything that has ever been thought that is of any worth whatsoever, but most of it is not worthy. And we're the ones, we can be our own touchstone. But that is not true. And in fact, if you step back and look at our time, you can see that we actually are not doing well in terms of things like, I mean, even physical health for how prideful we are about our medical system. People are not healthy, and we can just go outside, go to the mall, and you'll see. Um, and we ourselves, like, I mean, I definitely feel like I could definitely be healthier. And um, it does feel like there's something about the time that we live in that just doesn't feel healthy. But then not to mention spiritually and emotionally, there's a lot of hurt and areas that we just choose not to think about. So, I mean, certainly moral areas. So for us to have just a little bit of humility and to think that maybe this saint, whom probably the greatest theologian of our time, Pope Benedict, looked up to and made the doctor of the church, one of only four doctors of the church, female doctors of the church. I think, yeah, we could learn something for sure in those areas specifically that you're mentioning.
Is there more about the book or other thoughts or takeaways that you'd wish us to have?
Well, I do want to just say that there are some health remedies. There's one section that's health remedies, and there's one section that's recipes. And I think that that makes it a lovely book. It's a lovely book to put on the coffee table. So while there might be more comprehensive herbal guides, they're not going to be as beautiful
It
to
is
put on your
beautiful.
table. And I actually think that there's a lot of virtue in that because, sure, like you're going to want that encyclopedia, but I know that when I was a child, I learned a lot from the books that my parents had that I was drawn to because of their beauty. And I could definitely imagine a child first leafing through and seeing the beautiful book plates, the prints of the beautiful herbs. They're antique prints, sourced from different places, but they're really beautiful, beautiful illustrations that can also help you identify the plants, which is always just a bit of a problem. A lot of plants have lookalikes, and so it is really important to know what their roots look like, what their actual leaves look like, and how they're formed, how the petals on the flowers. You have to be extremely observant to know and like the best way would be to go out with someone, but the second best way is to have really good illustrations. So I could see a child being captivated by the illustrations and then starting to look at the remedies and wanting to make them. I could definitely imagine an interested 11-year-old or 12-year-old saying, Mom, let's dry these herbs. Let's make this tincture. How would you do that? And I mean, it's written out here. And then make some of the recipes. If somebody's sick, I could see the teenagers taking over that or the 8-year-olds. Why not? And so I think as part of their education, a book like this that draws you in with its beauty, I think actually is a a valuable addition to the library. I think we need more than just like the reference books. We need the beautiful books too.
I can definitely see this book as being an inspiration for lower level science. So you see the
Oh
beautiful
yeah.
pictures, go out, find those, and I do appreciate that the author has been careful to kind of warn us that this has a lot of lookalikes that are dangerous or whatever. So don't just pop it in your mouth, sort
Yeah.
of thing. But
Yes. Well, and it's funny how, like before I got interested in medicinal herbs, I remember just like, oh, my husband does have he does get hay fever, he does have allergies, and he would say like, "Oh, the ragweed is really getting to me." And I remember thinking I had heard that goldenrod and ragweed are lookalikes. And after a while I started to say, "Well, what is the difference?" And when you really are just, when you start being just a bit observant, they actually don't look that much alike. And you just have to know, and you just have to go out there and look at them. And the goldenrod is much more beautiful than the ragweed. The ragweed is kind of, it looks like what it sounds like. And what's so interesting is that the bees do not go to the ragweed, but the bees do go to the goldenrod. So the ragweed is just, I don't know what it's for. I don't know what you get out of it. There must be something, but but it turns out not to be that hard. Or yeah, so for sure, if you're ignorant and you haven't been observant, you can make a mistake. But as soon as you delve into it, your eyesight is honed, your powers of observation are honed. This is so good for children to practice because I have a whole section in my book about science, the beginning of science being observation, which is the Aristotelian idea. And I think that we really need to recover that for our children's scientific education. That, yeah, like having your little journal, your little nature journal, and really making a point of looking at the things, seeing how they're different, categorizing them, but especially being out there, like actually looking at the plants. I think that's huge. So as I said before, I was very excited to be involved with producing this book. I don't know if I'm the tippity top expert on this, but I had been studying a bit, and I certainly learned a lot. And yeah, I think it's a really worthwhile project.
It's a beautiful book and quite appealing. Yep. And the
Yeah.
pollinators are like the bees are pretty good signals that go where the pollinators are. It's a pretty
Yes,
good indicator.
it's so true. Yeah.
Okay. So we are going to have a link to the book in our show notes. Where do you like for folks to go to find out more about you, Mrs. Lawler?
Well, I am on my blog, likemotherlikedaughter.org, and on Substack. I have two Substacks. One of them is called The School for Housewives, and that's just short little inspirational posts that come to your inbox every day, most every day, um, along with an audio component if you just want to listen. And I also have Happy Despite Them, which is a blog I actually started before I started Like Mother, Like Daughter, but then it kind of fell by the wayside. Then I decided to and this is another thing that happened during lockdown, is that when it started to be a worry that, and I mean, it actually was a fact that people who were saying certain things were not um, getting as much traction in the algorithm as people who are saying other things. And so I kind of started to worry that maybe at some point I would be, since I was very outspoken about some of the policies, I started thinking, well, what if I just get banned, from Facebook? But I like just kind of pounding out some ideas. And so I thought, well, I better put these things that I want to say, I better put them on this other blog, Happy Despite Them. And then eventually I just moved it over to Substack. So those two things, Happy Despite Them and the School for Housewives, are on Substack. And my husband and I have a podcast, and that I publish that on the Happy Despite Them Substack. So it's a lot. I don't know why there's so many different things, but it just happened that way. Sorry.
A lot to offer.
So yeah, and they can also find me on Twitter and on Instagram under my name.
Okay. We will have links to that in our show notes.
Thank
we'll
you.
also have some links to the books that you mentioned and to relevant Kolbecast episodes. It sure has been a treat to meet you today. And I really appreciate you taking the time with us. And thanks again for coming to visit with us and telling us about this beautiful book.
I appreciate it so much. Thank you. God bless.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad maiorem Dei gloriam.